They swore we wouldn't take the island. We took it with fire and steel. The coral dust was still settling around my boots when I heard Lieutenant Morrison's voice cut through the acrid smoke. "Kowalski, get that satchel charge ready. We've got another cave complex up ahead." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because I was afraid, though God knows I was, but because I knew what they meant. More death, more screaming, more of that peculiar silence that follows when high explosives meet human flesh in the confined space of a coral cave. My name is Frank Kowalski, and I was a demolition specialist with the 1st Marine Division during what they called Operation Stalemate II, the invasion off Peleliu in September 1944. They told us it would take 3 days. We'd been fighting for 2 weeks, and the Japanese were still dug in like ticks on a hound dog, buried so deep in that coral rock that sometimes it felt like we were fighting the island itself. The morning of September 15th had started with the biggest naval bombardment I'd ever seen. For 3 straight days, our battleships and cruisers had pounded Peleliu with everything they had. The USS Pennsylvania, the Maryland, the Mississippi, their 16-inch guns had turned the sky range and made the ground shake like an earthquake. We watched from our landing craft, packed in tight like sardines, and somebody said, "Hell, there can't be anything left alive on that rock." Somebody was wrong. The first hint came when we hit the beach. Orange Beach One, they called it, though by the time we got there it was more red than orange. The Japanese had let us land, let thousands of Marines wade ashore and bunch up on that narrow strip of coral sand. Then they opened up. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, all of it coming from positions we couldn't even see. The coral ridges that ran inland from the beach were honeycombed with caves and tunnels, and every one of them seemed to have a gun barrel pointing our way. Men were falling all around me, some screaming, some just dropping without a sound. The coral sand was already dark with blood. "Move, move, get off the beach." Sergeant Mackenzie was bellowing orders, but half his words were lost in the noise. I grabbed my pack, 40 pounds of TNT, blasting caps, and fuse wire, and started running. Not toward the enemy, not away from them, just running because standing still meant dying. That's when I got my first real look at what we were up against. The coral ridges weren't just hills. They were fortresses. The Japanese had spent months, maybe years, turning Peleliu into a death trap. Every cave had been reinforced with concrete and steel. Every tunnel connected to 3 others. Every position had overlapping fields of fire. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the Japanese commander, had turned the entire island into one massive bunker system. I made it about 50 yards inland before a mortar round landed close enough to knock me flat. When I picked myself up, spitting coral dust and blood, I saw Lieutenant Morrison waving me toward a gap in the ridge line. "Kowalski, we need to clear the cave system. The whole advance is stalled." That's how I spent my first day on Peleliu, crawling through coral tunnels with enough explosives to level a city block, trying to kill Japanese soldiers who had no intention of surrendering. The caves were worse than anything I'd imagined. Narrow passages that forced you to crawl on your belly, sudden drops that could break your neck in the dark, and always the possibility that the next corner would bring you face to face with a Japanese soldier with a bayonet. By nightfall, we'd advanced maybe 300 yards from the beach. 300 yards in 12 hours, and we'd paid for every yard with blood. The corpsmen were working overtime, patching up Marines who looked like they'd been put through a meat grinder. I was sitting in a shell crater cleaning coral dust out of my rifle when Morrison crawled over. "How many caves did we clear today, Kowalski?" he asked. I thought about it. "Maybe a dozen, sir. Hard to tell. Some of them connect up underground." He nodded grimly. "Division says there's over 500 cave positions on this rock." Maybe more. 500. The number hit me like a punch to the gut. If we were clearing a dozen caves a day and losing men every time, how long were we going to be here? How many of us would make it home? "Sir," I said, "what's so important about this place anyway?" "It's just a coral rock in the middle of nowhere." Morrison looked out toward the ridgeline, where muzzle flashes were still flickering in the darkness. "Airfield," he said. "Strategic airfield. Once we take it, Our bombers can hit the Philippines, maybe even Japan itself. That's why the Japs are fighting so hard. They know what it means. I understood then. This wasn't just about taking an island. This was about proving that the Japanese Empire couldn't stop us, no matter how hard they fought, no matter how many of their men they were willing to sacrifice. General MacArthur was already preparing for his return to the Philippines, and Peleliu was the key that would unlock the door. But first, we had to take it, and the Japanese had other ideas. Part 2. Into the coral hell the second week was when things got really ugly. We'd taken the airfield, or what was left of it after our bombardment, but the Japanese still controlled the high ground. The Brogal Ridge stretched across the northern part of the island like a coral backbone, and Colonel Nakagawa had turned every cave and crevice into a firing position. They called it the Pocket, but that name didn't do justice to what we were facing. It was more like a coral maze designed by the devil himself. I was part of a special demolitions team by then, working directly with the flamethrower squads to clear the cave complexes. The routine was always the same: find a cave entrance, send in the flame teams to burn out any Japanese soldiers in the front chambers, then send me in with satchel charges to seal the deeper tunnels. It was dangerous work. One mistake with the explosives, one miscalculation with the fuses, and you'd bring half the ridge down on your own head. The morning of September 23rd started like any other. We were working on a cave system near Hill 200, one of the highest points on the ridge. Intelligence said it was a Japanese command post, heavily defended, with tunnels that went deep into the coral. Our job was to clear it out, section by section, until nothing was left but rubble. "All right, Kowalski," said Corporal Danny Martinez, the leader of our flamethrower team. "You ready for another dance with the devil?" I checked my equipment one more time. Satchel charges, each one containing 10 pounds of TNT, blasting caps and fuse wire. A .45 caliber pistol for close quarters work. And a flashlight that had to last, because if you got lost in those caves, you weren't coming out. "Ready as I'll ever be," I said. The cave entrance was maybe 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, cut in toothed coral like a mouth. Our reconnaissance team had already been inside. The ones who came back said there were at least 3 chambers, with connecting tunnels that went God knows where. 2 of our Marines hadn't come back at all. Martinez went in first with his flamethrower, a big M2-2 unit that could shoot burning fuel 40 yards. I followed behind, trying not to think about what 40 gallons of napalm would do in a confined space if something went wrong. The first chamber was maybe 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, carved out of solid coral. The walls were blackened from previous flamethrower attacks, and the air still smelled like burned fuel and something else I didn't want to identify. "Clear," Martinez called out. Moving to the second chamber. That's when we heard the voices. Japanese voices, coming from deeper in the cave system. They were talking quietly, but in that enclosed space, sound traveled like you wouldn't believe. I couldn't understand the words, but I didn't need to. They were waiting for us. Martinez looked back at me, his face grim behind the flamethrower's protective mask. "How many you think?" he whispered. I listened carefully. At least 3 voices, maybe more. "Hard to tell," I said. "Could be a squad. Could be more." The second chamber was larger than the first, maybe 30 feet across, with several tunnel entrances leading off in different directions. This was where it got complicated. The Japanese weren't just hiding in these caves. They were using them as fighting positions, connected by tunnels that let them move from chamber to chamber without being seen. You could clear a room, move on to the next one, and find that the first room was occupied again by soldiers who'd come up through a tunnel you hadn't even known was there. "Contact front," Martinez shouted, and opened up with the flamethrower. The stream of burning fuel lit up the chamber like a torch, and I saw them, 3 Japan Cecilgiers crouched behind a coral outcropping, their rifles aimed at the tunnel entrance. The napalm hit them before they could fire, and the screaming started. I've heard a lot of men die, but there's something about death by fire that stays with you. It's not quick, and it's not quiet. The Japanese soldiers were screaming and thrashing, trying to beat out the flames that were eating them alive. One of them managed to get to his feet and stumbled toward us, still burning, his rifle lost somewhere in the inferno. Martinez hit him with another burst from the flamethrower, and he went down for good," Martinez said, his voice shaking. But we weren't done. From somewhere deeper in the cave system, I could hear more voices. The Japanese had a whole network down there, and we'd barely scratched the surface. "Set your charges," Martinez said. "We're sealing this whole section." I moved quickly, placing TNT charges at the entrances to the 3 tunnels that led deeper into the system. The trick was to use just enough explosive to collapse the tunnels without bringing down the entire cave, and without killing ourselves in the process. Too little TNT, and the Japanese could dig their way out in a few hours. Too much, and we'd be buried under tons of coral rubble. "Fire in the hole," I shouted, and we ran for the entrance. The explosion was like being inside a thunderclap, a sound so loud and violent that it seemed to shake the entire island. Coral dust filled the air, choking us, blinding us. When it finally settled, the 3 tunnels were gone, sealed behind tons of collapsed rock. But even as we were climbing out of that cave, I could hear gunfire from other positions along the ridge. For every cave we cleared, there were 10 more. For every Japanese soldier we killed, there seemed to be 5 more waiting in the tunnels. Colonel Nakagawa had built a fortress that could absorb enormous punishment and keep fighting. That afternoon, I got my first real look at the Japan Sea defensive strategy. We were moving up the ridgeline, trying to clear a series of interconnected caves, when suddenly the whole hillside seemed to erupt in gunfire. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, all of it coming from positions that we'd thought were already cleared. "They're in the tunnels," somebody shouted. "They're moving through the tunnels." That's when I understood the genius of what the Japanese had built. It wasn't just a series of individual bunkers, it was one massive underground fortress, with tunnels connecting every position. They could reinforce any point under attack, evacuate wounded soldiers to safety, and reoccupy positions that we thought we'd already taken. It was like fighting a hydra, cut off one head, and 2 more would appear. The casualties were mounting. By the end of the 2nd week, the 1st Marine Division had lost over 2,000 men killed and wounded. The 5th Marines were so shot up that they had to be relieved by elements of the 81st Infantry Division. And we still hadn't taken the ridge. But we were learning. Every cave we cleared, every tunnel we sealed, every Japanese position we destroyed taught us something about their tactics and their defensive layout. Lieutenant Morrison had started keeping a map of the cave systems, marking each entrance and exit, each tunnel connection. It was slow, bloody work, but gradually we were figuring out how to beat them. "The key is the water," Morrison explained one evening, showing me his map. "They've got to have water sources down there and supply tunnels to move food and ammunition. If we can find the main supply routes and seal them off, we can starve them out." It sounded good in theory. In practice, it meant more time in those coral tunnels, more close quarters fighting, more Marines coming home in body bags. But it was the only way. The Japanese weren't going to surrender, and they weren't going to retreat. The only way to take Peleliu was to kill every single one of them, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel. Part 3. The grinding mill by October 1st. We'd been on Peleliu for over 2 weeks, and the island had become a grinding mill that chewed up men and spit out corpses. The casualty reports read like a disaster. The 1st Marines had lost 60% of their strength, the 5th Marines were down to half strength, and we were still fighting for every yard of coral rock. But something was changing. The Japanese resistance, while still fierce, was becoming more desperate. We were finding evidence that their supplies were running low, ammunition caches that were nearly empty, food stores that contained mostly rice and dried fish. Most telling of all, we were starting to find Japanese bodies that showed signs of malnutrition and disease. The siege was working. I was part of a special team by then, working directly under Captain Louis Bousel, the regimental intelligence officer. Our job was to locate and destroy the main Japanese supply tunnels, the arteries that kept the whole defensive system alive. It was precision work, requiring careful mapping of the cave systems and coordinated attacks on multiple positions simultaneously. The Japanese have been very clever, Bousel explained during our morning briefing. They've created a logistics network that's almost impossible to attack from the outside. But every network has weak points, choke points where multiple tunnels converge. Find those and we can cut off whole sections of their defense. The intelligence came from a variety of sources. Aerial photographs that showed suspicious coral formations. Reports from marine patrols that had penetrated deep into the ridge system. And occasionally, most valuably, information from Japanese prisoners, though there were precious few of those. Colonel Nakagawa had ordered his men to fight to the death, and most of them were following those orders. My first major supply tunnel operation came on October 3rd. Intelligence had identified what they thought was a major logistics hub, a large cave system near the center of the ridge that seemed to connect to multiple defensive positions. Our job was to get inside, map the tunnel network, and plant enough explosives to seal off the entire complex. The team consisted of 6 Marines, myself, Corporal Martinez with his flamethrower, 2 riflemen for security, a communications specialist to stay in contact with headquarters, and Sergeant Tom Mackenzie, who'd been fighting in these caves longer than Anion. Mackenzie was a hard man from West Virginia, 32 years old, ancient by Marine standards. He'd been on Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and now Peleliu. If anyone could get us through those tunnels alive, it was him. "Listen up," Mackenzie said as we prepared our equipment. "This isn't like the other caves we've hit. Intelligence says this system goes down maybe 50 feet into the coral, with multiple levels and cross-connecting tunnels. We go in fast, we map what we can, we plant our charges, and we get out. No heroics, no sightseeing. We're not here to win medals, we're here to go home." The entrance was hidden behind a coral outcropping that had been blasted and reblasted so many times it looked like the surface of the moon. We went in single file, Mackenzie leading with a .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun, Martinez behind him with the flamethrower, then me with my explosives, and the 2 riflemen bringing up the rear. The first tunnel was narrow and low, forcing us to move in a crouch. The air was thick and stale, with an underlying smell of death and decay that made breathing an effort. Our flashlights created crazy shadows in the coral walls, and every few yards we'd come across evidence of previous fighting, spent shell casings, bloodstains, sometimes a piece of equipment that had been dropped and forgotten. 20 yards in, the tunnel opened up into a large chamber, maybe 40 feet across and 15 feet high. This was clearly a major hub. 6 different tunnels led off in various directions, and the floor was littered with Japanese equipment. Supply crates, ammunition boxes, medical supplies, even a small portable radio that was still crackling with static, whispered Private Johnson, one of our riflemen. "It's like an underground city." Mackenzie was studying his compass and making notes on a piece of paper. "We need to check each tunnel," he said. "Map the layout, see where they go. Johnson, you and William stay here and watch the entrance. The rest of us are going exploring." The first tunnel led to a weapons cache, dozens of rifles, cases of ammunition, and what looked like parts for a heavy machine gun. I placed a small TNT charge with a short fuse, just enough to destroy the weapons without collapsing the tunnel. The second tunnel was living quarters, sleeping mats, personal equipment, and a small shrine with photographs of Japanese families. It was empty, but the sleeping mats were still warm. The third tunnel was where we found them. Martinez was in the lead when the shooting started. Muzzle flashes lit up the tunnel like lightning, and bullets ricocheted off the coral walls with a high-pitched whining sound. Martinez went down immediately, clutching his shoulder and cursing in Spanish. I could see the Japanese position now, a barricade made of coral chunks and sandbags, maybe 30 yards down the tunnel, with at least 3 soldiers firing over the top. "Martinez is hit," I shouted back to Mackenzie. "I need covering fire." Mackenzie opened up with his Thompson, spraying bullets at the Japanese position. I grabbed Martinez and dragged him back around the corner, leaving a trail of blood on the tunnel floor. His shoulder was a mess. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had nicked an artery. Blood was pulsing out with each heartbeat. "Corpsman," I yelled, though I knew there wasn't one. We were on our own. I used my belt to make a tourniquet, pulling it tight until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. Martinez was conscious but pale, his face slick with sweat. "The flamethrower," he gasped. "Don't let them get the flamethrower." The M2-2 was lying in the middle of the tunnel, maybe 10 yards from the Japanese position. 40 gallons of napalm, and a compression system that could shoot flames 60 feet. If the Japanese got their hands on it, they could turn our own weapon against us. I'm going for it, I told Mackenzie. Like hell you are. That's suicide. We can't leave it there. Mackenzie looked at me for a long moment, then nodded grimly. Give me 30 seconds to get in position. When I open up, you run like your ass is on fire. I waited, counting the seconds. From somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, I could hear voices, Japanese voices, probably calling for reinforcements. We were running out of time. Mackenzie's Thompson opened up with a sustained burst, emptying the entire magazine at the Japanese position. I ran. 10 yards never felt so long in my life. Bullets whined past my head, chipping coral from the walls. I dove for the flamethrower, grabbed it, and rolled back behind cover just as Mackenzie's gun went silent. Got it, I shouted. Good. Now let's get the hell out of here. But it wasn't that simple. From the main chamber, Johnson was shouting warnings. Multiple contacts. They're coming up through the floor. The Japanese had accessed tunnels we hadn't even known about. They were emerging from concealed openings in the chamber floor, surrounding our exit route. We were trapped. That's when I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. I fired up the flamethrower and opened the fuel valve. Everyone get behind me. I'm going to clear us a path. The stream of burning napalm lit up the chamber like the fires of hell. Japanese soldiers scattered, screaming, some of them already on fire. I swept the flame from left to right, clearing the tunnel entrances, buying us the seconds we needed to move. Go! 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 Mackenzie was shouting, and we ran for the entrance. Martinez was leaning on Johnson, his face gray with blood loss, but he was moving. Williams was firing his rifle at something behind us. I was backing up slowly, keeping the flamethrower ready. We made it out, but just barely. As soon as we cleared the entrance, I started placing my charges. Big ones this time, 20 pounds of TNT at each tunnel mouth, with enough explosive power to bring down half the ridge if necessary. The Japanese were still shooting at us from inside the cave system, bullets sparking off the coral around the entrance. Fire in the hole, I shouted, and we took cover behind a coral outcropping. The explosion was enormous, much bigger than I'd expected. The entire hillside seemed to lift up and settle back down again. When the dust cleared, the cave entrance was gone, buried under tons of collapsed coral. But we'd accomplished our mission. The main supply hub was destroyed, along with its weapons cache and ammunition stores. More importantly, we'd mapped the tunnel system well enough to identify 3 other major choke points. Over the next week, we hit them all. The effect was immediate. Japanese resistance began to weaken noticeably. Positions that had held out for weeks suddenly went quiet. When we investigated, we found evidence of starvation and disease, Japanese soldiers who had died not from American bullets, but from lack of food and water. The siege was working. Part 4. The final push by mid-October, the character of the fighting had changed completely. Instead of coordinated resistance from prepared positions, we were dealing with desperate, isolated groups of Japanese soldiers who were running out of everything: ammunition, food, water, and hope. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. A cornered enemy fights hardest of all. The breakthrough came on October 15th, when elements of the 5th Marines finally reached the northern end of the Brogal Ridge. For the first time since the invasion began, we had Japanese positions surrounded on 3 sides. But Colonel Nakagawa wasn't finished yet. Intelligence reports suggested he still had over 300 men in the deepest cave systems, and they were preparing for a final stand. My role had evolved by then. Instead of just clearing individual caves, I was part of a specialized unit tasked with destroying the command and control structure of the Japanese defense. We knew Nakagawa had his headquarters somewhere in the central part of the ridge, probably in one of the deepest cave systems. Our job was to find it and eliminate it. The operation began before dawn on October 20th. 3 Marine companies, supported by flamethrower teams and demolition specialists, were going to make a coordinated push into the heart of the ridge complex. The plan was simple: overwhelming force applied simultaneously at multiple points, designed to prevent the Japanese from using their tunnel system to reinforce threatened positions. I was attached to Company I, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, under the command of Captain Andrew Haldani. Haldani was one of those officers who led from the front, a quiet man from Massachusetts who'd already earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Navy Cross in previous battles. His Marines would follow him anywhere, and that morning he was leading them into the most heavily defended part of Peleliu. "Gentlemen," Haldani said during the final briefing, "intelligence believes Colonel Nakagawa's command post is somewhere in the cave system we're hitting today. If we can take out their leadership, this whole thing might finally be over. But make no mistake, they're going to fight like cornered animals. Every cave, every tunnel, every position is going to be defended to the last man." The attack began with a massive artillery barrage. Everything we had left was firing at once. 105mm howitzers, naval gunfire from the ships offshore, and even some close air support from Marine Corsairs. For 30 minutes, the ridge disappeared in smoke and flame. When it was over, we went in. The first cave system we hit was different from the others. Instead of the rough coral chambers we'd been fighting in for weeks, these tunnels were carefully engineered, smooth walls, proper ventilation, even electric lighting powered by a small generator. This was clearly a command facility of some kind, "Stay alert," Haldani warned as we moved deeper into the system. "This feels like a trap." He was right. The Japanese had turned the entire cave complex into a killing ground. Every corridor had multiple firing positions. Every chamber was designed to channel attackers into prepared kill zones. And everywhere, there were booby traps, grenades rigged to explode when doors were opened, mines hidden under loose coral, even poison gas released from concealed canisters. We lost 3 Marines in the first 10 minutes. Private Reynolds stepped on a mine and was killed instantly. Corporal Davidson opened what looked like a supply closet and took a grenade blast full in the face. Sergeant Williams was caught by a sniper firing through a concealed loophole and died before the corpsman could reach him. But we kept moving. That's what Marines do. We advance, regardless of casualties, regardless of obstacles, regardless of fear. And gradually, systematically, we cleared the complex room by room. The command post was in the deepest part of the cave system, 50 feet underground, connected to the surface by a single narrow stairway. When we finally broke through the last defensive position, we found ourselves in a large chamber filled with maps, radio equipment, and documents. And there, sitting calmly at a small desk, was a Japanese colonel. He was a small man, maybe 50 years old, wearing a clean uniform despite weeks of siege warfare. His sword was laid out on the desk in front of him, along with what looked like a ceremonial cup. When he saw us, he stood up slowly and bowed. "Colonel Kunio Nakagawa," he said in heavily accented English. "I have been expecting you." Captain Halden stepped forward, his rifle trained on the Japanese officer. "Colonel, I'm placing you under arrest as a prisoner of war." Nakagawa smiled sadly. "I think not, Captain. My emperor expects more from his officers." Before any of us could react, he picked up the ceremonial cup and drank its contents in a single gulp. Poison, probably cyanide. He was dead within seconds, falling forward across his desk, still clutching the empty cup. With Nakagawa's death, organized Japanese resistance on Peleliu effectively ended. Over the next few days, we mopped up the remaining isolated positions, but the fight had gone out of the defenders. Some surrendered, the first prisoners we'd taken in weeks. Others committed suicide rather than face capture. A few simply disappeared into the deepest caves, where their bones are probably still lying today. The final tally was staggering. Of the original Japanese garrison of approximately 11,000 men, fewer than 300 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest, over 10,700 soldiers, were dead, buried in the coral caves they had defended so fiercely. Colonel Nakagawa's defense had been brilliant, but ultimately futile. American firepower, American determination, and American industrial capacity had ground down his fortress one cave at a time. Our own casualties were severe. Over 9,800 American servicemen killed and wounded, including 1,794 killed in action. The 1st Marine Division was so badly mauled that it had to be withdrawn from combat and rebuilt almost from scratch. For every Japanese soldier killed, we'd paid in American blood, but we had taken Peleliu. The strategic airfield was in American hands, ready to support the next phase of the Pacific campaign. More importantly, we had proven that even the most fanatical Japanese resistance could be overcome. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already cracked at Guadalcanal and Saipan, was completely shattered. The path to Japan itself was now open. Part 5. The price of victory shooting stopped on November 27, 1944, 74 days after it began. 74 days of fighting for an island that measured just 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. 74 days of hell carved out of coral rock and human determination. I was sitting on the beach where we'd landed back in September, cleaning my rifle and watching the supply ships unload construction equipment. The airfield was already operational. B-24 Liberators were taking off every few hours, heading north toward the Philippines and Japan. The strategic objective had been achieved, but the cost still hung over the island like smoke from a funeral pyre. The bodies were everywhere. We'd been collecting them for weeks, American bodies for burial in the temporary cemetery near the airfield, Japanese bodies for mass graves bulldozed into the coral. The smell of death was so pervasive that you stopped noticing it after a while, but it was always there, a constant reminder of what this place had cost. Lieutenant Morrison found me there as the sun was setting, painting the western sky the color of blood. He'd been wounded twice during the campaign, shrapnel in the leg from a mortar round, and a bullet through the shoulder from a sniper, but he'd refused evacuation both times. Now he was finally being shipped out, along with what was left of our regiment. "Kowalski," he said, sitting down beside me on the coral sand. "I wanted to thank you before I left. You did good work here. Good work." I looked out at the ocean, where the transport ships were waiting to take us away from this cursed place. "Did we win, sir?" "I mean, really win?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "We took the island," he said finally. "We accomplished the mission. The airfield is operational, and our bombers are already using it to hit targets in the Philippines. From a strategic standpoint, yes, we won. But I keep thinking about the cost. 11,000 Japanese dead, 2,000 Americans dead, thousands more wounded, many of them crippled for life. Was this little piece of coral rock worth all that? It was a question that would haunt me for the rest of my life. In the immediate aftermath of victory, it was easy to focus on the strategic importance of Peleliu, on the airfield that would help shorten the war, on the message we'd send to the Japanese high command. But in the quiet moments, when the guns were silent and the dead were buried, the doubts crept in. Had we accomplished something significant, or had we simply fed 10,000 men into a meat grinder for no good reason? The historians would argue about it for decades, some claiming Peleliu was a crucial stepping stone to victory, others insisting it was an unnecessary bloodbath that accomplished nothing the bypass strategy couldn't have achieved more cheaply. What I knew for certain was this: we had faced an enemy who was willing to die for every yard of ground, who had turned an entire island into a fortress, who had sworn that Americans would never set foot on Japanese soil. And we had beaten them. Not easily, not cheaply, but completely and utterly. When the final count was made, over 13,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had died defending Peleliu, while American forces, despite taking heavy casualties, had achieved total victory. The Japanese garrison that had boasted it would fight for months had been eliminated in 11 weeks. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen to American firepower and determination. Most importantly, the myth that the Japanese would never surrender, that every invasion of Japanese-held territory would result in fanatical resistance and massive casualties, had been proven false. Yes, they fought hard. Yes, they died bravely. But they died, and we lived, and their empire was one step closer to collapse. As I packed my gear that final night, I found myself thinking about Colonel Nakagawa. He'd been a good officer, maybe even a great one. His defensive strategy had been brilliant, his tactics sound, his soldiers devoted to him. Under different circumstances, Fighting for a different cause, he might have been someone I could have respected. But he'd chosen to serve an empire built on conquest and brutality, and that choice had led him to a coral tomb 50 feet underground. The transport ship that took us away from Peleliu was crowded with wounded Marines, men who would carry the scars of that coral hell for the rest of their lives. Some were missing limbs, others were blind or deaf from explosions. Many bore invisible wounds, the 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much death, the jumpiness that follows months of constant danger, the nightmares that would wake them screaming for years to come. But they were alive, and the Japanese weren't. In the brutal mathematics of warfare, that was what mattered. We had proven that American industry, American firepower, and American courage could overcome any defense, no matter how fanatical, no matter how well prepared. The road to Tokyo was paved with coral and blood, but it was open. 6 months later, I was part of the invasion force that landed on Okinawa. The lessons we'd learned on Peleliu, about cave warfare, about coordinated operations between infantry and demolition teams, about the importance of cutting supply lines, served us well in that final, terrible battle. And when Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, standing on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, I couldn't help but think that the path to that moment had begun on a small coral island where 13,000 Japanese soldiers had sworn they would never let us pass. They were wrong. We took their island with fire and steel, and we buried their empire in the coral caves where they made their last stand. The cost was terrible, but the alternative, a world where fascist powers could hide behind impregnable fortresses and claimed they were untouchable, was worse. That's what Peleliu taught us. That's what all those young Marines died for. Not for 6 miles of coral rock, but for the principle that America would go anywhere, fight anyone, pay any price to defend freedom and defeat tyranny. It was a lesson written in blood on a coral beach, and it echoed around the world. The Japanese had sworn we wouldn't take their island. They were wrong. We took it with fire and steel, and we kept moving toward Japan itself, carrying the memory of our dead and the promise of victory. In the end, that was enough.